Thousands killed, hundreds held hostage, countless families homeless. In Israel and Gaza today, there is nothing but death and destruction in the air. And the worst is yet to come. Israel, still mourning its dead, prepares for war, knowing it will cost yet more Jewish lives. In Gaza, also grieving for its dead children, no water, no power, chaos and fear. In Britain, protesters take to the streets while fear mounts in Jewish communities. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly had to run for cover while visiting southern Israel this week. He'll update us on the situation and the British response. We'll ask, is there a limit to the UK government's support for Israel? Labour's also standing firmly behind Israel. The Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy is here to explain his party's position on what could prove a long and bloody conflict. Mark Regev advises Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. After a week where thousands have died, we'll discuss what Israel's trying to achieve and alleged war crimes in the conflict. Palestinian journalist Marwan Bishara is an author and political analyst. We'll ask how this brutal conflict is viewed in the region and whether others could become involved. With us throughout the morning, three independent-minded political insiders. The former EU Foreign Policy Chief, Baroness Catherine Ashton, the journalist and author Rachel Shabi, and the activist and former advisor to Boris Johnson, Nimco Ali. Thank you for joining us on this sombre Sunday morning with Trevor Phillips. It is 1 week since Hamas terrorists brought death on the Sabbath. They brutally killed 1,300 people in Israel and still hold at least 100 hostage. Now, the people of Gaza are bracing themselves for Israel's imminent retaliation. More than 2,000 are already dead. Here at home, tensions are rising. Some Jewish schools have closed their doors in fear. It's hard for everyone to take a step back from these tragic events, to lower the temperature, to seek out the light rather than the heat. But our job as journalists is not to join in the point scoring and the finger pointing, but to try to add to your understanding of this dreadful conflict. So let's start by finding out the latest news from the region. A short time ago, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. Foreign Secretary, many of our viewers will have relatives and friends in Israel and in Gaza. We know that there were British hostages being held by elements of Hamas. First of all, let's just start with where we are now. As far as you know, will the Rafah crossing out of Gaza into Egypt open any time today, any time next couple of days?
Look, it's incredibly hard to say with any certainty. I've spoken on a number of occasions with my Egyptian counterpart. We stay in very close coordination with the United States of America, with other friends in the region, and of course with the Israeli government as well, trying to coordinate a time window when the Rafah crossing can be opened so that people can leave. That is proving incredibly difficult. So I'm not able to say with any certainty when that crossing may be open.
What is the obstacle? The Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has clearly been doing the leading on diplomacy here. Are the Egyptians resisting? What is the problem?
Well, the problem is it's the coordination of a number of parties, including the Egyptian authorities, including the Israeli authorities, and of course, including Hamas, who have a stranglehold on Gaza itself. And having that coordination is incredibly difficult.
So somebody's having to talk to Hamas?
Yes, look, and this is, I'm sure you can understand, this is incredibly difficult, and we will keep working on it. This is very important for the British nationals in Gaza. We continue to support them. We continue to update them as much as we can through text messaging and whatever other means is available. So we will keep supporting the British nationals in Gaza, and we will keep working with the US, with the Israelis and others to try and bring this crossing into use.
What about hostages? There are British citizens amongst the hostages. Do we know how many?
Well, again, one of the real challenges, and I'm not comfortable implying that we or indeed anyone else has certainty on this. The Israelis, when I spoke to them, when I visited Israel, are still having the terrible job of identifying those people who have lost their lives, trying to track down who is still missing. We know there are British nationals amongst the dead, the wounded, and probably amongst those who have been captive. But at this stage, it's not possible.
I know you can't say exactly, but we're given to understand that there are at least 10. Is that a reasonable?
Well, look, again, I mean, that is not an unreasonable estimate of the kind of number of people that we're talking about. But again, I'm really, really uncomfortable implying that there is certainty where, frankly, there is none.
Understood. And I know you don't want to get into a place where people might be endangered and so on. One other thing on the current situation for Brits. The government already laid on, I think, 3 repatriation flights. How many more do we expect?
Well, that will be, again, this is very, very dependent on circumstances. We're working closely, our transport department are working very, very closely with the Israeli air authorities about keeping airspace open. We are looking to maintain commercial flights and supplement those with charter flights organised by the British government. The exact nature is fluid, depending on the safety of the airspace over Israel.
All right, let's talk about what the Israeli Prime Minister has called the war. What are your expectations about how soon an incursion might take place? Hours, days?
Well, I'm speaking with my Israeli counterpart on pretty much a daily basis, so I haven't got specific details about the planned timings of future Israeli Defence Force operations. We know that they have been communicating with people in North Gaza through various forms of media, including leaflet drops, saying they should vacate the area. That looks, of course, to be the prelude to some form of further military operation. But I don't have details as to exactly what that will be or exactly what the timing is.
But imminent is a good word to use here.
Well, I think so, because the actions that the IDF are taking with regard to encouraging civilians to leave the area indicate the kind of things that you would do prior to a further military action.
Let's talk about the advice that you or counsel you may be offering to your Israeli counterpart, because in these situations, as steadfast as you might be in your friendship, one element of friendship is giving good advice. The Israelis say that they plan to eradicate or eliminate Hamas. Are you saying to your Israeli counterpart, this is a realistic objective? I mean, is that plausible?
Well, the conversations that we have had, and this is very much the tone of the conversations that I had when I was in Israel recently, is there is a feeling that they have got to secure that southern part of Israel from terrorist attack. They have to protect themselves from terrorist attack. Hamas has been a roadblock to peace for decades. They refused to be part of the Oslo Agreement. They completely rejected two-state solution. They consistently call for the eradication of the state of Israel and the targeting of Jews around the world. And Israel clearly feels that they have got to permanently protect themselves against terrorist attack.
I understand the reasoning. What I'm wondering is whether anybody seriously thinks that's actually a realistic war aim.
And Trevor, you're right that friends speak honestly with friends, and we have a very, very good working relationship with the Israeli government. And whenever I have spoken to them, I've reinforced the UK's position about the preservation of life, the avoidance of civilian casualties. I know the Israelis completely understand that. President Herzog has said their operations will be in accordance with international law. And I've said that it is in Israel's interest to avoid civilian casualties and Palestinian casualties, because Hamas clearly wants to turn this into a wider Arab-Israeli war, or indeed a war between the Muslim world and the wider world. And none of us, including Israel, want that to be the case. And so that's why we do give that strong advice from a position of friendship.
And would, in that strong advice, would the word restraint figure?
Well, I've said that restraint, discipline, these are the hallmarks of the Israeli Defence Force that I want to see. And indeed, those are the hallmarks of a high-functioning military organisation, which the IDF is, in stark contrast to the terrorist atrocities perpetrated by Hamas. And I've said, maintain that clear distinction. Israel seeks to avoid civilian casualties. Hamas seeks civilians in order to target.
So to be absolutely clear, our government's position is full support for Israel, full support for military action, but we are urging restraint and discipline.
So I think that is a pretty good synopsis, because, of course, we respect Israel's right to self-defence. They've experienced the most horrendous terrorist atrocity, which is still being perpetrated. Images of people being held, images of bodies being desecrated are still sloshing around on social media. So, of course, they have every right, and we support this right, to protect themselves. Whilst doing it, we've said, do everything you can to minimise civilian casualties, do everything you can to prevent Hamas getting what they want, which is this to escalate into a wider regional conflict.
You're a military man yourself, and you will know much better than I do about the exigencies of the battlefield. Nothing's going to be perfect. There's always chaos and so on. However, all officers are tutored and told clearly that there's law, there are ethics and so on. I want to ask you about that. Are there limits to what you, as a government, will support in Gaza, given your, in principle, support? But is there a red line that would cause the UK government to suspend, withdraw its support for Israel?
Well, of course, all support internationally is contingent on the behaviour of the partner country, and no country, including the United Kingdom, would give carte blanche to any other nation, and that is a universal truth, not specifically about Israel. But I have received regular commitments from the Israeli leadership, both military and civilian, that they are conscious that the people of the Palestinian people themselves are being used by Hamas, and they recognise that. And they're very, very conscious of their responsibilities. And as I say, President Herzog made specific reference to international law. And of course, what we want to see is both Israelis and Palestinians safe and secure, not living under the yoke of terrorism, in peaceful proximity.
The Israelis are being accused by some of war crimes, the use of white phosphorus shells, which are weapons declared illegal by the international community. They say, not them, nothing, that's not being used. Do you, from what you know, is that a credible denial?
Well, what we have seen over and over again is accusations directed at Israel which have proven to be completely baseless. So any decisions that I make or the UK government makes will be based on accurate assessments rather than social media speculation. So, and I would counsel people who are seeing these reports is be thoughtful. There is a huge amount of disinformation floating around. It is better to pause and wait before making a judgment call on what may prove to be completely unfounded accusations.
I want to come to discuss our situation in a moment.
Sure.
Just one other thing. There is a feeling, best expressed, I think, by President Zelensky himself, that this crisis will divert attention and support and, critically, material resources from Ukraine. What reassurance have you given Ukrainians that there will be no change in this country's support for them?
Well, in our planning around our support for Ukraine, I instructed my officials to look at what would happen if, whether coincidental or opportunistically, other major events happened. So whilst we couldn't predict the detail of the situation, these terrorist attacks in Israel,
So you've got a buffer.
it is not a surprise that other major events happen whilst we support Ukraine. Our support for Ukraine is enduring. We have made a commitment. We stand by that commitment. And I've also instructed the officials in the Foreign Office to make sure that we remain particularly vigilant for other opportunistic malign actions that might take place around the world.
All right. Over the last few days, we have seen reported a spike in anti-Semitic incidents here at home. How worried are you about community relations? And in particular, what can you say this morning to reassure British Jews that the government has their best interests at heart and that they will be protected?
Well, I give that absolute commitment. On the first meeting, the first cross-Whitehall meeting that we had in Cobra, we discussed this very, very issue. The Home Secretary was absolutely clear that our duty to protect British citizens and people in the UK, irrespective of their religion or background, is completely unwavering. We recognise that the Jewish community in the UK, sadly, is often targeted because of events in the Middle East. And sadly, it appears that that is happening again. So we've given an extra £3 million to the Community Security Trust, which is the organisation specifically created to protect the Jewish community in the UK. The Home Secretary has written to police chiefs around the country demanding that they increase their vigilance and support for the Jewish community. And of course, whilst protest is part of a free society, one of the things I would say is there is a very clear difference between being supportive of the Palestinian people, which of course the UK is, and glorifying terrorism or supporting Hamas, which is a fundamentally different thing and completely inappropriate and indeed illegal.
Well, that is exactly a point I wanted to put to you, because we have seen yesterday, in a perfectly peaceful major protest, people carrying banners in support of Hamas. We have seen people with pictures on their clothes with images of paragliders who descended into southern Israel and murdered more than 200 young people at a music festival. Why aren't those people in jail this morning?
Well, the police will, of course, where they are able to and where it is responsible, take action where people are flouting the law with regard to support for Hamas.
Press photographers could take photographs of these people. The police must also be able to see them.
Well,
why weren't they arrested?
So again, the point is about whether arrests may happen at all or whether they happen at the event or after the event. So I'm not going to drift into operational policing. But the simple point is I would remind people that being passionate about a better life for the Palestinian people is a passion that I share, and indeed shared by government. However, glorifying murder and terrorism is no benefit to the Palestinian people, just as Hamas are no friend of the Palestinian people.
One last question, just for you. We saw images of you and your visit to Israel, essentially having to run for cover. What was going through your mind? What was in your heart at that moment? Well,
I mean, I made a decision that I would go to southern Israel. I recognised that there were risks involved in that. I mean, sadly, for the people living in southern Israel, moving quickly to bomb shelters in response to air threat alerts is a regular occurrence. They were very, very used to it, and therefore it was quite reassuring. No, I mean, I wasn't afraid because, as I say, the swiftness and professionalism of the people that I was with was incredibly reassuring. The sad thing, of course, is that they are so used to this. For them, this is now habitual in terms of how they move quickly to those air raid shelters. But it really, really struck me that this is a regular occurrence. for the people in southern Israel and indeed across other parts of Israel. This is why I think it is so very, very important that we recognise that Hamas is stirring up tensions intentionally for their own political aims, and we should be very conscious of that. No friend of the Palestinian people, certainly no friends of Israelis, and that is why we feel very strongly that this issue has to be addressed.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.
Trevor, thank you.
To our panel now, Baroness Catherine Ashton was the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs. She visited the region, including Gaza, many times. Rachel Shabi is a journalist and author who spent much of her career focused on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Nimco Ali is a Somali-born activist and a former advisor to Priti Patel as Home Secretary. Let me start with what I thought was the most interesting thing, maybe new thing that the Foreign Secretary said, which is that he's clearly had a conversation with the Israelis about restraint, and he has received assurances. Cathy, credible?
I think so. President Herzog has been pretty clear that it's very important that Israel respects international law. And the Israelis will be thinking about three things. First of all, that this is a very overcrowded area, 25 miles, 2.2 million people. They'll be thinking about the hostages. They'll be thinking about the risks of this becoming a broader, bigger conflict, that others might get involved, particularly their minds will be on Hezbollah. So for
in
Israel,
the West Bank, coming from Lebanon.
Coming from Lebanon. So for Israel, it's about making sure that they approach this with the objective in mind of dealing with Hamas, and only that.
Rachel, what do you think? Did you? I was a little bit surprised that actually he was so frank about the exchanges with the Israelis.
I think the first thing to say is that Israel has repeatedly, habitually violated international law and has done so for decades with immunity from the West. But I think you're absolutely right that there is pressure in the background coming from the international community upon Israel, and that's probably why we haven't seen a ground invasion yet, because the Israeli army is ready to go. We have every human rights organization in the world, virtually, practically everyone you can think of, every arm of the UN, warning of an unmitigated humanitarian disaster that would befall Gaza if there were a ground invasion. As we know, 2.2 million people live in a very crowded, sealed strip, roughly the size of East London. Half of them are children. They've already experienced 5 bombardments since the Gaza Strip was sealed off in 2006. 2 of those, 2008, 2014, were horrendous. Thousands of lives lost, hundreds of children. And so you can see that there is some international pressure. You can see that the words of the US have slightly changed, but they haven't changed anywhere near enough, because what we are looking at is ethnic cleansing, and we have to say it what it is.
We'll come back and go through all of that in a moment. Nimco, the Israelis were very aggressive in their language at the end of this week, and actually most people seem to have expected them to be in Gaza now, but we haven't seen that. No. What do you think's going on?
I think the fact that James's words were very compassionate, I think the fact that he consistently talked about Palestinian lives as opposed to this just being about Israel being able to do what it needs to do, I think that was incredibly powerful. I think there is a moment of accountability, and because of social media and because of the fact that these kind of, however Israel attacks or actually goes back in, it's going to be on display. I think that there is a conversation for restraint. And I think one of the key things that James said, which was very specific, is the fact that there's a difference between a terrorist organization who seeks to hurt civilians and an armed army with, precise and the ability to be able to, target those. So I think there was a clear distinction between a terrorist organization and a state
The inequality of arms question. Yeah. All right. Let me just, if I may, talk to you, Cathy, for a few moments about your experience in Gaza, because you've probably spent more time in Gaza than anybody who is not Israeli or Palestinian in your time as the EU Foreign Affairs boss.
Yeah.
What do you think the vulnerability of Gaza is right now? I mean, what is going on inside there now?
So what you will have is a huge number of really frightened people. It is a sealed place. The crossings are closed. As the Foreign Secretary said, lots of conversations going on with Egypt to try and get Rafah, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt, open. Lots of attempts to try and get people to places that are safer, but a recognition that it's incredibly difficult. You only have to go into Gaza for a very short way to see how overcrowded it is. Its infrastructure is pretty bad anyway, because a lot of the materials that you would need to replace that infrastructure have not been allowed into Gaza for a long time.
In fact, you were funding quite a lot of what was going on in Gaza when you were at the EU.
We were indeed, and that was the first reason I went into Gaza, and it was the Israelis that let me in through their crossing, which they call Erez. I think I was the first person to go in sort of officially from that after the bombardments in 2008-9 had happened. And we were funding lots of different things, but it's an example of what Hamas does, that we were funding for children all of their summer activities. Special schools for catching up on maths, like schools all over the world. Lots of activities for children for playing, and Hamas would try and destroy them. Yeah. Because they didn't want that. You know, they've taken control. They're not the will of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and that's why it's really important that we are conscious of looking and protecting.
This is an important point, because it's, the last elections in Gaza, 2007?
Yeah.
Gaza elected Hamas, and I think it's quite hard for somebody who has not been there, not looked people in the face, to understand how it can be that there's 2.2 million people who everybody says, majority of whom are not aggressive, don't want to be part of this, yet they elected what essentially is a terrorist death cult.
2006 is a long time ago. I'm not going to make excuses for what people did then, but a vast majority of people in Gaza now might well do a different thing if they were given the opportunity. A lot of young people have grown up. A lot of people have had no other experience, because what happens, as we know, all over the world, is when people who want to be oppressive take control, the last thing they do is call another election. So Hamas are there, they're in control, they've been in control for such a long period of time, and they've decided what kind of society, what kind of life people are going to have. Now, if you add into that the fact that Gaza has been blockaded, that it's been very difficult to get things in. When I first went, the number of things allowed into Gaza was tiny. So there's a combination of factors.
Rachel?
Look, there is a wider context here, and we have to look at it. And I want to be clear that to explain is not to justify. There's no justification for what Hamas just did in Israel. It was mass, indiscriminate slaughter. The images coming out of southern Israeli towns, Kfar Aza, Kibbutz Be'eri, are images of hell. And Israelis are traumatized, and so are Jews. We're looking at a decades-long military occupation by Israel of Palestinians, which is deadly and causes misery and suffering every single day. We're looking at a system which human rights organizations, including the Israeli B'Tselem, including Amnesty, have described as apartheid. We're looking at every aspect, every peaceful means to reach a resolution, whether that's diplomacy, whether that's politics, whether that's law, blocked
Rachel.
by the international community. And so when you look at why people end up supporting Hamas, that has to be part of the context.
Rachel, I'm only stopping you because we have to go to the next break in a moment, but obviously the Israeli government would reject that, and we will no doubt hear from a representative of the Israeli government a little later on all of that. It is now coming up to 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Foreign Secretary has told this programme that friends speak honestly with friends, and that he wants to see Israeli forces act with restraint and discipline. James cleverly said no country would be given carte blanche to act, and he'd received assurances from the Israeli government. Still to come on this programme. In just a moment, we'll hear from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. We'll go live to Tel Aviv to speak to the former Israeli ambassador to the UK, Mark Regev. And we'll be joined live here by the author and political analyst, Marwan Bishara. At 9 o'clock, let's get the very latest on the situation in Israel and Gaza. I can speak now to Sky's Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, who is in Jerusalem. Good morning, Ali. What is the latest on that imminent incursion?
So we're still in, I think describe it as a lull is perhaps slightly misleading, but we're still in that sort of waiting game before a ground incursion, if that is what is going to be ordered, is launched. Every indication points towards some sort of ground incursion. What form that will take and when it will happen, we still need to wait and see. There were some reports circling around Israeli media today that it might be the fact that there's quite a lot of cloud cover today that has delayed the incursion. I have no information to suggest whether that's true or not. I think you also need to look at the diplomatic track that is going on simultaneously. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has done a tour of the region. He's currently meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But crucially, he's been in Qatar. And the Qataris have a direct link to Hamas. The Hamas political leadership are based in Doha. And so if there is negotiations underway regarding hostage releases, humanitarian corridors, or anything else of the like, then the Qataris could play a major role in that. He will then go, Blinken, to Cairo to speak to the Egyptians. And of course, when we're talking about a humanitarian corridor, the Egyptians need to be heavily involved in that as well. So there is hope that there might be some sort of diplomatic step forward. But the Israelis remain very, very determined and have not veered off that course. They are there to destroy Hamas, to change the landscape in Gaza for good. And at the moment, I can't see anything deterring them from it.
Ali, thank you very much indeed. You'll be reporting through the day. Stay safe. A little earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Foreign Secretary. That's Labour's David Lammy. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary James cleverly says in the national newspaper this morning that there will be no resiling from support for Israel. Do you agree with that?
I think that must be right. Look, I'm thinking of Celine Ben Nagar, a young woman who should be completing her maternity leave and is a hostage at this point in Gaza, having left behind her husband and her new young baby. Israel has a right to go and get those hostages. It has a right to degrade the military equipment and rockets that have been used against it, to deal with the tunnelling of Hamas. And we must recognise that Israel is facing a huge existential crisis. 1,300 people dead, murdered, babies raped. And against that backdrop, of course they have the support of the UK government, and I would not seek to be partisan about that, except to say that it's hugely important that that is done, as Keir Starmer has said, along the lines of international law.
Well, let's address this, whether it's possible and how Israel might do what you've just said. Mr. Netanyahu says his war aim, he uses the word war, is to eliminate or eradicate Hamas. Do you think that is actually possible, to completely wipe out Hamas?
Look, I think the starting point for me is two important things emerged from the Second World War. The first was a home for the Jewish people following the Holocaust and the unbelievable murder of that community. And that is Israel, and that is why we defend Israel. The second thing was the rules-based order, a rules-based order that is currently under attack from dictators and autocrats across the world. So when he says he wants to root out this prescribed,
eliminate.
This prescribed terrorist group, war is ugly. It happens when diplomacy has ended. 1,300 people are dead. He is entitled to have his own operational desire to see an end to Hamas, and we support him in that.
Even if that operational desire leads to carnage that sweeps up all kinds of people who, by anybody's standards, are not part of Hamas?
No. We must distinguish between Hamas, a terrorist group, and the Palestinian people.
Okay.
And anyone who has seen the faces of bewildered children who have lost their parents, of people fleeing for their lives, of course, it is, I said, international law must prevail, and that means that you have to minimise civilian casualty, that people must have access to water, to medicine, to food, to electricity, and that there must be humanitarian corridors where people can pass without being bombed. That is the case in any war situation. Those are the rules of war. We have those rules precisely because of the Second World War and the way it was fought.
Foreign Secretary, this is very interesting because we haven't heard anything of what you've just said from the Israeli leadership. So let's just take that bit by bit. Is your overall point here that Israel must do what it must do, but it must do so with restraint?
I think that the international community, you've heard from Antony Blinken, Emmanuel Macron, Lloyd Austin, all are saying that Israel has a right to defend itself, but they are reminding Israel of those obligations. And why are they doing that? Because the truth is, Israel faced the hardest of choices, Were this the UK, 1,300 people murdered, a country invaded, of course, these are very tough choices. But we do not put, when you're a democracy, you do not put to one side the need to minimise civilian casualties.
I noticed in the list of countries
as hard as that is.
I noticed in the list of countries you've just cited, Macron and so forth, you did not include our government. Are you saying that you think our government has been slow on the uptake, it hasn't said what needs to be said to the Israelis?
Trevor, I'm not coming on the show today to depart from the cross-party consensus that I think there must rightly be at this very serious and gravest of times. So I don't want to be critical of James Cleverly, and I'm very conscious that as the country's chief diplomat, he will be having private conversations with the Israelis, private conversations with Egypt next door, the Jordanians, the Qataris, of course the US, all in an attempt to minimise the loss of life and particularly civilian casualties.
You're trusting that he is doing all that can be done?
Well, look, I was grateful to have a Privy Council briefing earlier this week to bring me up to date. This is a difficult, stressful, delicate time, particularly for the Israelis, but we must hold dear to the rules of war.
All right. Well, let's think about what that means in practice. Your leader, Keir Starmer, said earlier this week that Israel has the right, I'm quoting here, to withhold power and water from 2.3 million people in Gaza. Do you stand by that?
Keir has been clear that international law must be followed. He's a human rights lawyer.
You're a lawyer. You're a lawyer too. I'm asking you if you stand by that statement.
He's very clear in today's papers. There has to be humanitarian access. That means access to water, to food, to medicines, and of course utilities, and there should be safe passage for people within the country.
So
he's absolutely crystal clear in that, in his statement that's in all of the papers today.
This is important. The Israelis have been equally clear that they are turning out they have turned out the lights, they're not going to turn them back on, that they are not going to supply water. The implication of what you just said is that you think the Israelis are wrong to do that.
I'm not going to sit here as a sort of armchair general or lawyer attempting to make assessments when I'm not on the ground and this is an operational situation. It's my job, I think, to assert what I believe to be the rules of the game. This is a very serious situation, but it must be done according to international law, and that means that aid has got to be there, and I am concerned at the suggestion that people should evacuate hospitals. I think that is incredibly unlikely for those who are very seriously injured and humanitarian workers that put themselves in harm's way. And in all war situations, those people remain, and there is still an obligation to minimise civilian casualties in those circumstances.
Israel has told 1 million people to move south of the Wadi Gaza, to the southern half of the Gaza Strip. There is an injunction in the Geneva Convention against forcible displacement. Is Israel right to require that those people should move from the north of Gaza?
Well, look, as I said, I'm not going to play armchair general, except to say that I think there was a lot of concern that the initial instruction could not be met within the timetable that had been set out. And I'm pleased to see that that timetable has been extended. And I suspect it's been extended because of the concern that many people voiced that this was not possible.
That's a
clearly informing the population, letting people know what is about to take place. It is clear, and Netanyahu has said that land, sea and air is about to arrive.
I understand that.
People need to be out of harm's way.
I understand that. And these are the practical points, but both you and your leader are lawyers, and he particularly has operated in this area. It is not entirely clear when you say Israel must do what it must do, but within the bounds of international law, that point you made about people having to move out of hospitals, the point we've just been discussing about people having to move, 1 million people having to move, that these are consistent with the requirements of international law, is it?
Two things in response to that. The first thing is, if you are Jewish watching this show this morning, if you are Israeli, if you have concerns about repulsive terrorism, I want to put the spotlight on where this starts, and it starts with Hamas, very, very clearly. I think the second thing to say is that faced with that abysmal terrorist action, none of the choices available to Israel are easy choices. Okay. As we sit here a week later, none of those choices are easy.
Okay.
They have a right to defend themselves and to root out and find those terrorists and those hostage and degrade the military equipment that's being used against them. And we would have that same right were it us, Trevor.
You've been unequivocal in your support for Israel. Let's talk about the impact of this situation here. Nothing, obviously, compares to what people in Israel and Gaza are going through. But how worried are you about the reported spike in anti-Semitic incidents in this country and the palpable fear that exists in the Jewish community that you've just referred to?
I am horrified that we have Jewish families deciding to take their children out of school, kids not wearing uniform, people that think it's okay to use the most awful slurs and hate against a minority community. And I say this representing the Stamford Hill area of London, which is a historic home for the Jewish community, and we must be robust, we must stand up to it. And it's important to say also that the hate that's rising across our country towards Jewish people is happening in a week where we come together to stand up to hate. This is anti-hate week in our country, and we should be concerned also about the rise in Islamophobia.
Let me put this to you, David, that people in the Jewish community will no doubt welcome what you said, but what we're hearing a lot is that in spite of the words, the actions and the demonstrations of support that might have been extended to other communities are not being extended to the Jewish community. And specifically, Friday, in last week, your football team, Tottenham's been absolutely down the line in its backing for Israel. You were vocal in your support for footballers taking the knee, LGBTQ diversity, Ukraine and so on. Was the FA correct to refuse to light up the Wembley Arch in support of Israel?
That must rightly be a decision for the FA. Had it been my decision, I would have lit up the Ark. And I think that across the world, you've seen public institutions show their support at that critical moment because of the horrific way in which this would have started. So I would have done it. But that must be a decision for the FA.
The Labour Party has advised its MPs and councillors to stay away from protests. We saw tens of thousands of people in London yesterday, largely peaceful. But there were people carrying banners in support of Hamas. There were a couple of people who were adorned, I think is the right word, with pictures of Hamas terrorists coming down on paragliders. Should those people have been arrested? Because we have a law here about glorifying terrorism and terrorists. Should they not have been arrested?
Well, look, I mean, I think that these are decisions that it's right that the police make on the ground. Let me give you a distinction. We have to live in a country where people are free to wave their national flag and be proud of where they come.
This is a different thing.
But if you are doing that outside a synagogue, clearly intimidating and harassing, you're contravening the law. So there's clarity.
This was in the middle of London. It wasn't a synagogue. The Labour Party's taken a clear view. It's said to its people, don't go on demonstrations. Now, that's going to be a judgment for councillors and MPs to take. And really what I'm asking you is to set a line for us. What is permissible in terms of supporting Palestinians? Carrying the Palestine flag, one thing, but banners in support of Hamas?
We live in a free society, but we do not tolerate intimidation. And I am not here to act as the director of public prosecutions and to make those determinations on the ground. Those are determinations that are rightly for the police and subsequently the courts.
David Lammy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back to our panel now, Baroness Cathy Ashton, Rachel Shabi and Nim Koali. I should just explain to you and to viewers that because of James Cleverly and David Lammy's schedules, we had to interview David Lammy before James Cleverly, so he wasn't aware that Cleverly was going to say restraint and discipline. So to be fair to him, he didn't know, when he was commenting on Cleverly, he didn't know what Cleverly was going to say. We've just been told that the Israelis are saying that they are going to keep allowing people to evacuate southwards. Nimco, that's quite a big signal that actually what we thought was a really hard deadline yesterday probably isn't quite as hard as...
It's not, because I think the whole conversation is both between David Lammy and James, and other people have been saying it. It's the fact that the humanitarian aspect of this is very key. And I also want to say a key thing as somebody that works in social norm change. you can't bomb an ideology. So this idea of the fact that you're going to eradicate Hamas by bombing is not the way to do it. You have to be able to have conversations with the separation between Hamas and the Palestinian people. So I do think that there's restraint coming from the Israeli government, and I think that's something that needs to be welcomed.
Rachel, I want to ask something else about Israel itself. This has been, by all accounts, one of the biggest intelligence failures of Israel's history. And, you know, Hollywood movies tell us how fantastic the Israeli security services are. The political effect of this, does this mean, do you think, that Israelis themselves will lose, whatever happens with Netanyahu and so on, will lose confidence in their own establishment to protect them?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing that happening already. There's so much anger on the streets of Israel. You know, whenever you see Israelis being interviewed, they're furious, they're livid with the Netanyahu government, and they do feel abandoned and exposed. And at the same time, it has to be said that we have a context here where, you know, David Lammy talks about diplomacy. What diplomacy? There hasn't been any for decades. The Western leaders have allowed Israel to believe that this brutal military occupation, that this system of apartheid is sustainable. And it's not. It's not sustainable. There's only a political solution.
I have to put that to Kathy, because if there's been no diplomacy, what was she doing?
There's been a lot of diplomacy, but I think what Rachel talks about is there's been a lot of diplomacy, not much result. And I think diplomacy is only, in people's minds, effective when you see the outcome that takes things forward. I spent huge amounts of time in Ramallah, in Jerusalem. I worked closely with Secretary John Kerry, who, you remember, did shuttle diplomacy like had not been seen for a long time. But it was incredibly difficult to try and get through what we all know are the basic premises of a two-state solution. It was very difficult to be able to deal with the combination of issues for Israel about security, which of course will now be even more complicated, and for the Palestinians about their rights of return or the rights of people for land that they believe have been theirs for centuries. So it's extraordinarily challenging. You always hope as a diplomat that in times that are just so appalling as we are seeing now, that at the end of this, there is an opportunity for diplomacy to work again and to actually make the progress we want.
I want to show the three of you something which happened this morning, which slightly surprised everybody in Sky. Here are James Cleverly and David Lammy greeting each other in a way like brothers. Yeah. And one of the things that's interesting here is that the government and opposition have been in lockstep for a whole week, when actually that wouldn't necessarily be the case. Ninko, do you think there's a slight danger here that the opposition will stop doing its job, which is to hold the government under scrutiny? No, there's not, because there are times when politics have to, be put aside, and we have to think about humanity. So I think the point is, seeing the words from David Lammy in terms of support for the Jewish community here in the UK and also for the state of Israel, that's a complete change to what we've heard from Labour before. And then ultimately you have the conversation about diplomacy and looking after citizens within the Palestinian communities in Israel at the moment. So I think this is something that has to happen in order for us to be able to get to peace and security. And I think Rachel's been a bit unfair to what's happening in Israel at the moment. I've been 4 times in the last year, and the vast population of the state of Israel are peace-loving people that actually want to be able...
I mean, that's just not true. It is true. And I say that as someone who knows Israel very well.
Okay, well,
it's moved further
Rachel,
right.
hang on.
It hasn't, though, but that's why there's been protests for the last,
Those are not peace protests, they're anti-Netanyahu protests. There's a big difference.
Yeah, who are against the extremists that are getting into the government. Okay. So I think we're being completely unfair anyway to the Israeli...
We're going to come back to this. We have plenty of time in the programme. Coming up, we'll go live to the Gaza border to get the very latest from the situation on the ground in southern Israel.
I'm Greg Milam and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
Back to our panel now, Baroness Cathy Ashton, Rachel Shabi and Nimco Ali. Cathy, there are of course 5,000 people who died in the last week, but I think two other things have died. One for certain, the agreement that was heralded between Saudi and Israel, and quite possibly now the idea of a two-state solution.
So there's no question that Hamas, in its thinking about when and how to do this, was mindful of the agreement that was moving forward between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And it's part of this pattern called the Abraham Accords, which began with countries like the UAE and has moved forward.
And they've made agreements on trade and other things with Israel.
They have. I mean, these are not deep commitments yet. These are fairly shallow in the sense that they're about the first steps to what you might call some kind of normalisation. It's about trade, it's about tourism, and so on and so forth. And if you go to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, you'll see the building of a church, the building of a synagogue, the building of a mosque side by side in an area that will be set aside for religious leaders. So there's definitely a kind of move that you can see physically that sort of suggests this shallow potential. But, of course, what's happening now puts everything on hold. I'm always reluctant to say things have died because my experience of how things move forward is that they never go in a straight line, they never go smoothly. So certainly on a big pause, let's put it that way.
I want to come to a shadow that's lingering over all of this in a moment, which is Iran. But Rachel, what's your view about the state of the two-state solution, the possibility? Many people are now saying it's gone.
I mean, to be clear, obviously Hamas was never interested in two-state. But let's be clear, neither was the international community. And let's be clear, there is no possibility. Two-state has been dead for a very long time. It's just, I'm very sorry, but people have been reluctant to admit it. You cannot go to that region and say that a two-state solution is a viable alternative, a reality on the ground, because Israel, with its settlements expansion in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, has made that impossible. And also, all efforts to get Israel to comply with international law have failed. But I do think you ask an interesting question, as in, what is the possibility of it now? And I would say this Hamas atrocity has taken a peaceful resolution. It's taken it back decades.
Nimco?
I think the Abraham Accord, which was spoken about before, is actually kind of like a ponying thing. As a Muslim person who's actually kind of grown up in this concept where anti-Semitism was normalised, to be able to go to Dubai, to be able to go to the Middle East and to see Jewish people who are authentically being Jewish, or even direct flights from Israel to the Middle East, I think that's a conversation changer. I know Rachel has more of a history there, but I think there is hope. I think there are still people that want to be able to find a two-state solution, or about the point of actually trying to live side by side. And I don't necessarily think that the Saudi Arabia-Israeli normalization is actually also dead in the water as well. I think there's a generation, especially my generation and younger, that need to step away from this radicalization of the fact that this is some kind of holy war that we have to fight. We have to be able to walk towards peace, and we have to be able to understand that the Jewish people have the right to a homeland.
I have to say, though, that I'm really ancient, and I've heard this story that young people will reject it and all that for maybe 40 years. And my impression is still, generation after generation, actually, things have stayed, at best, stayed the same. And it's conceivable that out of this conflict, particularly in Gaza, there'll be a new generation of people for whom hostility is natural.
But we have to come back to, and I say that as somebody, like I said, I grew up in the UK, and I grew up in the concept where anti-Semitism and the dehumanisation of Jewish people was normal, and I think that is still okay in certain communities. It's the fact that you can't even have a logical conversation about the fact that 40 babies were beheaded, and you say that, and you should. Okay, see, look, this is what I mean. This is what I mean.
Rachel, Rachel, hang on, let her speak. Let her finish this point. Rachel, oi.
But I said a rational conversation. I didn't say, so this is what I mean. So the whole point is the fact that you can't even express any kind of sympathy, whether it's
Sorry, carry on.
This is what I mean. Whether it's one child or 40 children, it's the whole point of when Jewish lives are at risk, or the Jewish people are the ones that are being harmed, we're consistently coming with this conspiracy. So I think that there is still hope, but ultimately we have to be able to challenge about the dehumanization of Jewish people, which is normal, just like jumping in when I say babies.
I just want to make clear that it's an atrocity either way.
We're going to go to...
It doesn't matter how they die.
Nimco, Rachel,
hey.
Hey, this is a studio where there is peace. Thank you very much. Okay, stop it.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Stop it, you two.
Okay.
We should, by the way, have had Mark Regev, the former Israeli ambassador and advisor to Mr. Netanyahu, in this part, but he, in fact, has been summoned to speak to the Israeli Prime Minister. But as you can see, we're still having a lively discussion here. Coming up, I'm going to speak to the author and political analyst Marwan Bishara.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Israeli operation in Gaza is already having a severe humanitarian effect. More than 2,000 people have died and thousands more have been injured or forced to flee. Israeli defense forces say that they will stop supplies of food, fuel and water until all hostages have been returned. There have been pro-Palestinian protests in Western countries and furious reaction within the region. So how will people there feel and how could those countries respond to Israeli action? I'm joined now by Marwan Bishara, a Palestinian Arab author and political analyst who was born in Nazareth in Israel. Good morning.
Good morning.
As I say, you were born in Nazareth. What do you think the likelihood of what is happening in Gaza, or in southern Israel, I should say, spreading to create more conflict in the West Bank, Lebanon and so on?
Well, clearly in past situations of this sort, there was a kind of a mutation, a proliferation of the conflict within Gaza into what we call 48, meaning within Israel, into the West Bank, East Jerusalem, as well as we've seen it also flare in Lebanon and so on.
48 referring to 1948 boundaries.
Exactly. And I think this time around it could actually be far more dangerous because the situation is far more volatile. And clearly there have been signs, and apparently there have been now news of the non-state actors in Lebanon, like Hezbollah and in Syria, and even Iran itself making noise about it's not going to allow Israel to simply crush Gaza while it's trying to annihilate Hamas. So I think the idea of this thing spreading is a possibility, is even a probability. And that's why the United States has decided to dispatch its armada, right? The Ford Naval Strike Force, its most modern and lethal military presence to these Mediterraneans, just a couple of years after President Biden said he's going to end the forever wars. Now the Americans and the British are back into the Middle East, probably on the cusp of a new war in the region. And that's pretty dangerous because while they're trying to stop things from escalating, they're actually escalating the situation by a huge military presence in the region that's going to make everyone nervous.
I want to come back to the regional politics, talk about Egypt and Iran and also the United States. But let's just talk a bit, if I may, because we haven't really heard too much, I think, about what might have motivated the original events that have kicked off this particular phase in the conflict. The acts that took place last Saturday were pretty much unique, even against the background of vicious violence in the region. Why do you think the Hamas terrorists chose to do this, killing babies, taking hostage, old people hostage? Why that at this time?
Look, what I found a bit striking is that the last week we've only heard from every other Western official talking about unprovoked attack. So let's just get that to bed. It was provoked, right? Because provocation is not just about what they've done the night before. Provocation is about 55 years of horrific occupation of a people, of 70 years of siege of the Gaza Strip, of 75 years of dispossession. So there is provocation. Well, occupation...
You'll forgive me, I do have to stop you there and ask you, what conceivable provocation could there be for the murder of 40 babies? What conceivable provocation in that 55 years could there be?
Because people are...
And I need to say, we need to be careful that there is no justification advanced here.
That's what I was going to say. People confuse justification with explanation. You don't have to justify something in order to explain it. Here, we are here in order to have a sober conversation so the British public can better understand what the heck is going on over there, right? So explanation is our duty, right? So explanation is not justification. To explain is to say the following, right? Violence continues over that part of the world because there are root causes, and the root causes are a system of violence. What is the system of violence? It's the military occupation. This is a system of violence. It's a daily physical, mental, and psychological torture of an entire people. Imagine you as a British person living for 55 years under a foreign occupation, humiliated every day with a major overspill of racism, right, by an occupying power that dehumanizes you every day.
I get that.
I just want to answer your question. I'm just going to say the following, just briefly. The violence of a resistance movement like Hamas is defined not by some ancient voodoo. It's defined by the nature of the occupation. And the occupation itself is also then defined by the nature of the resistance. There is a dynamic that goes on between colonized and colonizer. This what leads to this kind of violence.
I just want to give you the opportunity to be absolutely clear about this, because if I were listening to this interview, I might take from what you've just said two things. One, that actually this is all the Israelis' fault. And secondly, to repeat what I said a moment ago, that there is some way of justifying what happened last weekend. And, you know, one can call into aid the last 75 years and so on. But I just want you to be clear that you think that there are no circumstances in which that response was in any way legitimate, even in the face of the things that you've talked about. I just want you to be clear about that.
Oh, I'm very clear. And I'm astounded that you didn't get to hear what the breadth of what I'm saying. I'm basically against violence everywhere, against the killing of civilians everywhere, period. There is no, there's no buts and ifs about that. So I am against all violence. In fact, I'm a very pacifist kind of a person. I'm just trying to explain a very simple situation that's been going on
I know
for
you're
years.
telling me that's how it might be thought of, but I just wanted to be clear. There's not a view that you in any way advocate. Let me ask you something else about this. And you're an expert in the region. One of the things that, again, hasn't become very clear yet is whether this is independent action by Hamas or whether this is being motivated by wider forces. And, of course, Iran is always mentioned as the shadow over this conflict.
There's no doubt that Iran supports this kind of an action. Iran says for itself that it has not been orchestrating this action. Hamas's motivation is not Iran. Hamas's motivation is not even religion. Hamas's motivation, even though it's an Islamist movement, is anti-colonial nationalist sentiment that is shared by many Palestinians, even if most Palestinians would not necessarily share the methods, unsavory as they are, used by Hamas. But the general sentiment is that we need justice. We need freedom from occupation. There is a third generation of Palestinians. I personally have been speaking about this my entire life, and it doesn't end. And yes, Israel is at fault here, not because of what happened last Saturday. I'm talking about because the situation continues to worsen because Israel refuses to deoccupy, to free a people from its occupation. And there has been attempts after attempts after attempts the last 30 years in diplomacy and in nonviolent action. In 2018, 2019, tens of thousands of Palestinians tried to demonstrate peacefully in Gaza. What happened to them? Thousands were shot. Hundreds were killed by Israeli soldiers hiding behind sandbags. So the idea here is the following. You want to stop this Hamas thing from happening? You think there is a military solution in Gaza? Please, go ahead. Do what you need to crush Hamas. But I am telling you that you're going to create a major massacre, a genocide against 2 million people, and you're not going to resolve anything. Because the idea starts and ends with a very simple fact. You have to end the military occupation to resolve this problem.
So what do you say to the Israelis who say, we left Gaza, best part of 20 years ago, autonomous, elected its own government, and Gaza became a platform for a pogrom? What should the Israelis do in the face of what they've experienced?
Let's go quickly over this. First of all, it's a lie. It's a lie.
Well, What happened last weekend is what happened.
Israel continues.
It's not I mean, let's not go through that. I just think it's a reasonable question.
Trevor, could I answer your question?
I want you to ask the question that I asked you, rather than.
No, I'm talking about not you. You are not lying. I'm talking about you're repeating a lie. Israel has not ended its occupation of Gaza. Israel redeployed out of Gaza and it took its settlers out, but it continues to besiege Gaza. And that's why it's able within hours to cut electricity, food, and goods from getting into Gaza. According to international law, Israel continues to occupy and besiege Gaza like it occupies the rest of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's a fact.
Marwan Bishara, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
So when I lost my baby 5 months into pregnancy, I felt embarrassed. I thought, what are other people going to think about me? I thought I must have killed him. Something I did must have killed him. And none of these things are true. And until people actually began telling me, obstetrician gynecologists and friends and specialists said, you know, it's very difficult for you to actually kill your baby or be the cause of the loss of that pregnancy. There's so much shame and silence, and as you said, it's uncomfortable for people around you to speak about this loss. So by more and more people speaking up, it does just become one of those things that you can cope with more as the person who lost the baby, but also everyone surrounding that person is able to say, I know a little bit more about this experience and therefore won't say the clumsy things that are completely well-meaning but are incredibly hurtful a lot of the time to those parents that have lost the baby. It's that thing about you can't blame anybody, because until it happened to me, I might have said things that weren't particularly comforting or appropriate too. But as you said, I'm glad you can get pregnant. You're young, you're healthy, you're in a relationship, or it's proof that you can carry children if you have one already. But these things are not helpful, and until you really begin to understand that, it's only then that people can really say the right thing. And I think starting with, I'm sorry that this happened to you, and just listening to the parents or those surrounding the parents who want to talk about this loss is a really good place to start, and crucial in allowing the parent to feel validated. Because when I lost my baby, I met him, he was a baby, and lots of people don't understandably understand that it wasn't just cells or a small mass. There's a baby that comes if it's later in pregnancy. And I felt very conscious of the fact that I was calling him my baby, and I was almost embarrassed to say my baby when the doctors were referring to him as a late miscarriage. So for me, it's baby loss all the way along, from the very moment you see the pregnancy line to full term.
Welcome back. This is Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Earlier on this programme, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, told us that he thinks an Israeli incursion into Gaza is imminent. Well, let's go now to the Gaza border in southern Israel and get the very latest from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. She is there on the border. Deborah, you are there with the Israeli troops. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I'm not on the border. I am in southern Israel and I'm with the Givati Brigade. They're about to conduct a training exercise. This is a combat-ready unit. They're ready to go into Gaza should the order come. And right now you can see soldiers driving past us as they go forward. They're simulating the kind of exercise, the kind of action that they would have to do if they are called to go into Gaza. This is a very highly trained, highly professional unit. It was a unit that went into Gaza back in 2014. I've been speaking to military people here who say to me that this unit is absolutely ready to go. Many of them are reservists. They've just been called up since the Hamas attack just over a week ago. A lot of them have been fighting to repel that assault, and now they are getting ready in case they are told that these units are going to have to go into Gaza. And what we're going to be seeing is this unit in action training. They've got tanks. They've got foot soldiers. There's also an engineering element that can deal with bombs, detonating bombs. They're expecting most likely that there will be booby traps and explosives in Gaza if they did have to go in. And like any military unit, of course, they have to train. And so we've been allowed to come and watch them as they are in this training. It was described to me as absolutely vital training, given the fact that the Israeli military said last night that they are preparing for potential of land, sea, air operations, combined manoeuvres with a focus on large ground operations. And if that were to come to pass, then it's almost certain that the Givati Brigade would be involved in going into Gaza.
Deb, thank you so much for that up-to-date report. Cathy Ashton, it's building up. It's not there yet. What's your feeling about where this is going now?
So it's obvious that Israel is going to move into Gaza because of the way that we can see the build-up on the border. As I said earlier, they'll be mindful of civilians, mindful of the hostages, mindful of the region, and in so doing, kind of juggling all of those things. We don't know where this will be in a week's time or a month's time. People talk about a long war. It's impossible to be sure. What we do know is that for Israel, the fact that all of their sophisticated security failed, in a sense, all of the things that Israeli citizens had been led to believe was an absolute about the security of their country now feels less secure, and the need for Israel to show that it is in control of this situation. That's what we know from that side. Okay. In the longer term, I hope we'll move forward to diplomacy again.
Nimco, Rachel, Cathy, thank you very much. It's a difficult morning. Not as difficult as it is for people out there. That's it for us this week. We'll be back with you next week. Thank you much for spending your Sunday morning with us.